Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the Department of Justice and the National Reentry Resource Center at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Thank you for joining us. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss reentry housing options for individuals convicted of a sex offense. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. We will also include that number on the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve during the webinar. However, we are recording today's webinar, and everyone who registered for it will receive an email as soon as it is available on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week. At the end of today's webinar, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers from the audience. All lines are muted except for the presenters. To ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible before we end at 3:30 p.m. today. My name is Lakeith Tavares, and I'm a policy analyst and technical assistance provider at the National Reentry Resource Center, which provides training and technical assistance to all grantees funded under the Federal Second Chance Act. Also joining us today are Dr. Kurt Bumby, Senior Associate for the Center for Effective Public Policy and Director for the Center for Sex Offender Management, Liz Whitmore, Housing Coordinator for the Vermont Department of Corrections, Derek Neodofnik, Restorative and Community Justice Executive for the Vermont Department of Corrections, and Paul Solomon, Executive Director for Sponsors, Inc. in Eugene, Oregon. Thank you all very much for taking the time from your busy schedules to join us today. Let's take a look at what we will cover in this webinar. Over the course of this webinar, we will review the latest findings on the relationship between improved housing stability and reduced recidivism for registered sex offenders, share stories from 2 communities that have found effective solutions to housing registered sex offenders, and discuss the numerous barriers to developing housing options for registered sex offenders, as well as strategies for overcoming them. Again, please submit your questions on the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand corner of your screen at any time. Before handing it over to our presenters, I will provide a bit more background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center and the National Reentry Resource Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff provides practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. The National Reentry Resource Center, which is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and managed by us here at the Justice Center, provides technical assistance for Second Chance Act grant recipients and support to SBA grantees and the broader field. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information for the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link on your screen after today's webinar. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kurt Bumby to discuss housing challenges for persons convicted of sex offenses. Dr. Bumby is a Senior Associate with the Center for Effective Public Policy. In this capacity, he provides training and technical assistance nationwide to policymakers, administrators, and practitioners across disciplines to support sex offender management, prisoner reentry, and other court-based initiatives. Dr. Bumby?
Thank you so much, Lahiz, and thanks to everyone who's joined. We've got such a large audience, which I think really highlights just how challenging it is for this population that we're working with to find suitable housing, and the practitioners and the role that they have. So what I'm going to do pretty quickly is just walk through with you some of the identified challenges, how it relates to potential risk, and then I will be passing it on to my friends and colleagues to talk with you about some promising strategies that they have going on. So what do we know, really, about effective reentry? We know a lot, right? We know a lot from the general population that we work with, and we know a lot about, really, what's going to be most effective for persons who have committed sex offenses. And, of course, if we have successful reentry with individuals who have committed sex offenses, we know that we're going to have increased public safety and reduced victimization. So to make that happen, we know that we've got to have good, solid, research-supported assessment tools that really help us think about individuals' level of risk in a reliable way, their intervention needs, maybe life skills needs, and all of that's used to guide our decision-making. Certainly, we have to have really good, really solid relief plans that include, of course, employment and things like housing. And if we don't have those in place, as you know, sometimes folks aren't able to get out of the facilities because they don't have something already lined up. To be effective in reentry with this population, we also need to make sure, just as we do with the general population, that our interventions, whether that's supervision, whether that's treatment, is really based on assessed level of risk and need, with higher risk sex offenders getting more intensive treatment or greater dosage, whereas the lower risk offenders get less. And then, of course, the needs around whether that may be sex offense-specific needs or other types of needs like substance abuse or other risk-reducing services. Some of those will happen in the institution, some will be in the community. There needs to be a linkage between those. And we know once the offenders get out, to support and continue facilitating successful reentry with this population, we've got to make sure that we have the right kind of supervision. And that right kind, based on the research, is a more balanced approach. It's not just about following them around and holding them accountable when they, don't adhere to conditions. Those are, of course, important, that enforcement piece, but also using officers' skills to promote change. So this really balanced approach to supervision is something that's really important. We got to make sure that we're able to track accurately so that we can monitor and know where individuals are. And then a few other things that we need are policies and laws that not only make sense, but that are effective, that are grounded in the research. Because as all of you know, when we have laws and policies that really aren't, we may not be having the desired outcomes. With this population, we also need to be really thinking about how what we do in terms of reentry strategies and policies and housing really take into account victims' needs and interests. We need to make sure, the research is really clear about this, that individuals have community supports, positive, intimate relationships, they're engaging in pro-social community activities, that they have good access to the ability to secure, and then the ability to maintain suitable employment that takes into account any risk factors that they may have that potentially could relate to reoffending. And then lastly, which is what we're here to talk about today, it's critical, of course, that they have housing that's stable, that's suitable, that takes into account, again, those risk factors for victims or victim access or substance abuse, whatever those risk factors are, that they have good, solid housing in place. And we know that unstable housing and unstable employment and a lack of social ties and all of those things relate to recidivism. So all the more reason we really need to make sure that we focus on those things. Now, about a year or so ago, we asked, probably many of you out there, we did a survey of several hundred practitioners across disciplines, whether it was parole board members, probation parole officers, community providers, correctional case managers, a whole host of folks. What is it that's most challenging for you when you think about reentry with this population? And not surprisingly, what you see here is that most of the folks said finding housing for releasing offenders who have committed sex offenses, that's our biggest challenge, our biggest barrier. And then, of course, employment, negative public sentiment, which, of course, relates to housing as well. Residence restrictions, they said, was a real issue. You know, these laws that prohibit individuals from living within certain radius of schools or parks or playground. They said that that was a particular challenge for offenders, and if you think about that, that also relates back to housing. They talked about specialized conditions, and then access to treatment and registration. Now, access to treatment also can be a function of housing, because if they don't have housing in an area that has ready access to treatment, well, then we've got a problem with accessing treatment, which is important because we know that relates to reducing recidivism. Then we ask several months later in a follow-up survey of you and your colleagues a little bit more detail about housing and employment challenges that you face and some thoughts and reactions you had to that. And as you can see here, the overwhelming majority of practitioners and policymakers involved in reentry with sex offenders said, in my jurisdiction, this is a big problem. Strongly agreed and agreed. There was no one who actually disagreed with this question. So overwhelmingly, people are finding this to be an extremely challenging issue. And it's not only challenging, but it's more challenging than it is for other populations who are being released and returning to communities. So this is, I think, very similar to what we see in terms of a lot of other challenges that we face with this particular population. You know, judges find sentencing in these cases tougher than other cases. Parole board members indicate that these are tougher cases than non-sex offense cases. And with reentry and housing, you all are saying, compared to others, this is tougher for us. So what is it that makes housing so challenging for returning sex offenders, those who are coming back to our community? A lot of this is fairly common sense. A lot of it you've experienced already. I've actually talked about a couple of those things, but just quickly walk through it again. I think we're all familiar with the fact that most of the people in the general public really don't want sex offenders in their communities. We see them protesting. We hear people talking about it. We've seen what happens when they do move in. They get driven out. So negative community sentiment is a real issue. Part of that negative sentiment can come from just not understanding fully what we know about this population. For example, that they're not all high risk, that they're not all going to recidivate. In fact, the recidivism numbers are relatively low. They don't necessarily understand the kinds of things, the good work that all of you are doing out there to manage this population and to ensure that they successfully return to the community. So just that lack of awareness can contribute to that. That lack of awareness can also contribute to what I mentioned earlier and that you see at the bottom of this slide, policies and laws that aren't necessarily grounded in what we know works and what we know doesn't work. Another challenge that we heard from people was that, you know, this really requires, just as reentry in general requires it, some good working relationships between those who are on the inside in the institutions and facilities and those on the outside, and really thinking about and planning for where this person can go before they get released. The challenge is resources. And I don't know about any of you on the webinar out there, but I come from a state that we are not rich in extra resources. So what we're finding is that agencies are struggling with financial resources as well as human capital, staff resources. The individuals who are coming out of prisons and facilities struggle, without question, with resources. And then in terms of housing availability and housing options, there are oftentimes very limited resources. And again, coming back to the laws and policies, another barrier is those laws and policies that are oftentimes really well intended, and they really are designed to protect our communities and reduce risk, but not necessarily grounded in what we know about individuals who commit sex offenses, who's most likely to be targeted, where these things happen, and then recidivism. If you take, for example, residence restrictions, which is the most common law or policy-related challenge to housing, if you think about that, just as a general community member, that kind of makes sense. If we have concerns about a given person who's molested children and they're coming back to our community, well, doesn't it make sense that we would want to keep them away from schools and parks and playgrounds and make sure that their housing is nowhere near those? So that makes sense in many ways, and in fact, it looks good on paper. When you talk about it, it actually kind of sounds good to most, and probably makes a lot of us feel good, right, because we think that we're protecting, kids that are in the schools and the parks and playgrounds, and it seems intuitively to make sense that that would be a reasonable strategy. The question is it actually effective? And if you think back on what we know about this population, most people who commit sex offenses, as you know, target those who are either known to them or acquainted with them. So live with them, live near them, live with family members or friends. It's a pretty rare circumstance, though it happens, it's pretty rare for an individual to go to a park or a school or a playground, commit an offense on site, or take the child away from that site and commit the offense. And so what's happened is these residence restrictions were developed around an idea that makes sense, but it's not really supported by the data about what the dynamics of offenses and victims and locations are. So for that reason, we shouldn't be surprised then that the research might not demonstrate that it's an effective strategy. So let me show you just a quick overview of what's been seen. A number of states, a number of researchers have taken a look at this, specifically looking at what happened in states prior to residence restrictions and then after residence restrictions. Did we see a decrease in arrest rates or charging? So was there a deterrence effect? Did we see a difference in whether folks recidivated at higher versus lower rates after the residence restrictions were in place? And is it true that being close to certain locations like schools, parks, playgrounds seems to be an increased risk for reoffending? And what you see here on your screen is that pretty consistently the research has not suggested that any of those things are in fact the case. There doesn't appear to be a link between residence restrictions and increased community safety or decreased victimization. But what the research has really shown and is drawing a lot more attention is that some of these residence restrictions have actually led to unintended consequences or collateral consequences that, interestingly, while designed to reduce risk and reduce recidivism, actually have led to increased risk factors, as I'll talk about in just a moment. If you look at this slide, this is from, over a decade ago, and it was out of Minnesota. And I used this one and the one that will follow because I think it really highlights just what happens in at least two jurisdictions when you superimpose residence restrictions, whether it's parks or schools. In this one, parks, yellow, school zones being the thick black line. You notice what happens, there's really no place to live until you start moving way, way out, which again raises the question about access to treatment, the ability to supervise and monitor, having positive pro-social supports. You see the very same thing in Denver County, and this was out of the Department of Public Safety, again, over a decade ago, but you will see the same thing just about anywhere you go. What ultimately happens is when you put these zones out there, you effectively displace individuals who have committed sex offenders into much more remote and distant locations. And what that has then is a significant impact. And it's not just residence restrictions. I mean, there are other conditions and policies that can lead to these things. But what we know is that housing barriers like residence restrictions, like negative community sentiment, all of those things that we talked about before, and lack of awareness or education among stakeholders about what works, all of those barriers can lead to some real concerns. One is we have folks who are parole eligible or at their minimum release date, and they're not leaving because we can't get a plan in place that addresses housing. Or as you saw on those two slides previously, we're pushing offenders out into locations where they can't necessarily be as closely supervised. They can't access treatment, can't necessarily access good employment. They're socially isolated. You're also seeing some cluster sheltering situations where you'll have a community or an aspect of a community that is really dense in terms of sex offenders, and of course, folks don't like that. You're also seeing, and this has been in the news a lot of homelessness in some states where there just really isn't any place that they're allowed to be. And of course, if you've got a homeless population or a really transient population, the question then is, how do you know where they are? How do you know what they're doing? How do we supervise them effectively? How do we gauge them in positive activities? How do we get them into risk-reducing interventions? And obviously, we can't necessarily do that if we don't know where they are. The other thing that's happened is, as you know, people are listing residences that are appropriate, but then they're actually living somewhere else that may not be an approved residence, which could have some, risk factors present that is, which is why they were prohibited from being there. Already mentioned the challenges with tracking and supervision, and then some final barriers. Final impact-related issues. We don't know so much about victim access and protection when we don't know where they are. Again, all of these things I've mentioned already. The bottom line and the bottom bullet is really the key message here, and that is, again, we really need to work hard, and I know you all are, on figuring out how we can develop suitable, stable, appropriate housing options. Because right now, with the various barriers that are in place, we're not getting what we need to get, which is safer communities and decreased recidivism risk. So we asked folks, have you got anything in place in terms of ideas or strategies that can help you deal with these barriers? Of that group that we surveyed, most of them said, no, we don't. And then we took it down a little finer and said, all right, well, where are you in terms of your planning with these issues? Almost half of them said, we don't have any strategies or ideas. Another third of them said, well, we've got some ideas, but we haven't really started any formal planning. And so what you see there, again, is people want to do things. They want to do the right thing. They want to figure out how they can do it, but they're just not at a place that they can necessarily because they don't necessarily know what to do. And what we do know is there's some great things happening in some jurisdictions. And what the purpose of this webinar today is to provide you an opportunity to hear about some of those very things that are happening out there. On this slide, you'll see that these are just a listing of a few things that folks are doing, taking their limited resources, stopping things that really aren't effective anyway and redeploying towards housing, looking at transitional housing, doing housing vouchers. There are, believe it or not, some states and jurisdictions who have taken a step back and said, you know what, we need to rethink this residence restrictions legislation and policy because we're hearing and believing that it's having a negative contraindicated impact. Education and awareness is super, super, super big, whether that's among policymakers, the public, housing officials. We need to sort of help them understand this population and what it is that we do and how we can work together. And then, again, really the best thing that I think can happen today and other opportunities is for you to hear from your peers. And so at that point, I'm going to turn it over to my friends and colleagues who are going to give you some of the great, great things that they're doing.
Thank you, Kurt. To share some stories from the community, I'm going to turn it over to Derek Miodofnik and Liz Whitmore to discuss effective solutions to housing registered sex offenders used by the Vermont Department of Corrections. Derek Miodofnik has been a professional practitioner in conflict transformation and restorative justice for the past 20 years. Presently, he is the Community and Restorative Justice Executive for the Vermont Department of Corrections, where he oversees the state's extensive network of partnerships with community justice centers and transitional housing providers. Liz Whitmore has been active in the field of housing since she graduated from the University of Vermont in 2004. Liz joined the state of Vermont as a corrections housing coordinator in 2013. Prior to that, she provided direct service at the Committee on Temporary Shelter and Program Administration at the Burlington Housing Authority, with a concentration on subsidized housing for special populations. Derek, Liz?
Thank you, Lahiz.
Thank you.
So we'll start by giving a broad overview of the Vermont Department of Corrections, just to give you some context, and then we'll drill down a little further to our transitional housing programs, and finally we'll talk about a couple of specific models that intentionally serve the folks that we're talking about today. Sorry, a little technical difficulty.
Oh, did we lose
Wi-Fi? Oh my gosh. Should I do this again? It says for the presenter. Oh gosh. The timing.
Got it.
Oh.
I think we're good.
Can you hear us? All right, thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. So just to give some context for the Vermont Department of Corrections, as of June of 2015, there were about 2,000 people incarcerated, both in-state and out-of-state. 7,800 or so folks were supervised in the community, and 850 of those were on conditional reentry or a furlough status, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. The average cost for a year of incarceration in Vermont is about $62,000, and that doesn't, if we're looking at women specifically, that's much higher, around $85,000 per year. At any given time, there's about 150 inmates who are held past their minimum sentence due primarily to a lack of approved housing, and 1/3 of those are serving a sentence for a sex conviction. So Vermont is unique. Anyone that's ever been to visit here would know that. Our DOC sits within the broader Agency of Human Services, which is very different. Many states sit within the Public Safety Division. So this frames the way that we approach supervision in general. It's a much more holistic approach.
Are we heard?
Sorry. Vermont also operates as a unified department, which means we manage offenders throughout their term of custody. Whether they're incarcerated or supervised in the field, they have a connection to a facility caseworker as well as an assigned field probation or parole officer. And also, Vermont has legislative support for restorative justice, which is evidenced by an RJ policy, which was enacted in 2000. And this creates a framework for a restorative response at the earliest onset of a crime across systems throughout the state. And we can provide that specific language if anyone's interested. We can provide that to Lahiz. So to talk specifically about our transitional housing programs, DOC transitional housing began in 2004 as a response to legislative priorities with the goal of reducing overcrowding in our in-state facilities as well as the reliance on out-of-state prison beds. So currently we have about 325 transitional housing beds across the state, which are made available through grants to an array of community partners. Since the onset of transitional housing in 2004, our budget and the number of beds that we're able to provide has grown tenfold. And we're funded primarily with general fund dollars with a small amount of global commitment or Medicaid dollars that supplement. And the average cost for a year of transitional housing is just under $22,000. The types of transitional housing programs that we have vary wildly. We have congregate houses that serve 3 to 20 residents. We also have scattered site apartments, which may be a master lease held by a grantee or just general leases that are held by the residents with support from case managers. Also, the level of structure and services provided varies based on the needs of the residents that are living there. Last year, these programs served over 1,000 people with various levels of need and risk and offense histories. The general target population for all of our housing programs is offenders returning to the community from incarceration, and we're also able to serve those folks who are supervised in the community and are at risk of reincarceration due to unstable housing. Most of the participants are supervised on a furlough or conditional reentry status, which means that they're serving a portion of their incarcerative sentence in the community. So for any number of technical violations, they could be relodged. And then because our programs are funded with DOC general funds, rental assistance or housing funding has to stop when someone maxes out their supervision, although services sometimes continue after.
Great. So Derek here, I'm going to pick up. Thank you, Liz, for giving sort of that general context. That again, Vermont has some unique characteristics that we tried to play to our strengths, and in the same way, you know, we offer this information in a way for other jurisdictions to just think about what are the features and conditions that might allow some of these principles that have driven some of our success to be applicable in the environments that you know best. So kind of concurrent and parallel with the development of our housing partnerships was originally a separate set of partnerships for what are called community justice centers. For about 20 years, the Department of Corrections has been very intentional in recognizing that if we are really to be successful in our ultimate goal of safe and successful reintegration of individuals, that communities and community members and non-professionals need to be part and parcel of that process. Otherwise, it's not, in fact, reintegrative. So over the course of those 20 years, through granting, we've supported what are called these community justice centers. They were originally all municipally based centers, and the goal is for citizen involvement in addressing the conflict stemming from crime. So they fall under the broader rubric of restorative justice, and they take a relational approach to harm stemming from criminal behavior. And in these justice centers, an array of restorative services are provided with a small number of paid staff and largely based on the social capital derived from local citizen volunteers. And we'll get more into one of these programs momentarily. But just to give you a little picture of the infrastructure, there are 21 of these centers across the state in most of our kind of population hubs, if you will, but that's a very relative term for our state. And some are now nonprofit organizations, and others still remain hosted by the municipalities. So there's an arm's length partnership that's happening here between the state level and local level, which is important. The justice centers themselves have become networked into their own nonprofit organizations so they can begin to advance their own best practices. One of those, and really our leading practice, which draws on a heavy social integrative model and also increasingly has been braided with our housing, which you'll hear about, is circles of support and accountability, or CoSA. You may have heard of this model. It's a model that grew out of the Canadian experience working with maxed out sex offenders, and we've expanded a couple dimensions of this model to include but also extend beyond those who have sexual convictions and apply these circles with folks who are under DOC supervision. So there's a key blending of informal and formal authority. But there are supervision and restorative reentry strategy that works with moderate to high-risk offenders. These are offenders who are coming out from incarceration, and they're paired with 3 to 5 trained and locally supervised volunteers, and that supervision comes through a reentry coordinator at a justice center. So these are employees of local community justice centers, which again are municipally or nonprofit based. But there's a voluntary entering into a structured and mutual relationship with an individual who's coming back after usually a significant period of incarceration. And of course, as Dr. Bumby referenced, finding housing is a challenge, and then the stabilization of the housing is a big piece targeted by this model. So the Department of Corrections provides the financial resources and the practice standards through centrally managed grants, and that's the work of our unit here within DOC Central Office. And then this gets operationalized through local referrals at the probation and parole offices throughout the state. So they identify the high-risk, high-need people about to come onto their field supervision caseload, and they engage the local community justice center to in turn recruit, train, and supervise the citizen volunteers whose job is really to legitimize the social contract. And then in doing so, ensure compliance with the broader conditions of release, some of which, as we know, are very, very difficult to adhere to. You know, that's really what we kind of think of as the legal contract. So they leverage social capital to provide the type of pro-social opportunities and investment in staying within the bounds of their, again, highly restrictive conditions of release, and they provide assistance in doing that. So it takes very practical forms, such as transportation, which again came up in Kurt's you know, well-described list of some of those barriers. All of this is with the broader goal of no more victims. So it's restorative in that while a lot of time and energy goes into working with the core member, that's the offender, with whom the circle is formed around, the final goal here is safer communities and no more victims. 58 new core members were engaged over the course of state fiscal year 15. And again, these are now individuals who've been wrapped with 3 or 4 volunteers who meet on a weekly basis with them at a minimum, and then have throughout the week other check-ins and kind of one-on-one meetings and grab a cup of coffee and have a call and have, you know, have the type of contact that people who are integrated into a community enjoy. Some quick data on it, and then I'll loop this back out to the strong housing tie. This comes from a colleague at the University of Vermont, Dr. Kathy Fox. This is pretty fresh data, and as a matter of fact, she's still digging into some sub-layers of it. But I'll point out that on your left is the recidivism percentages running across the bottom are the 2 comparison groups, one that had CoSAs, one that did not have the benefit of them. And then that's broken out of the 3 typologies of offenders, the blue being sexual offenders, the orange violent, and the sort of greenish being anyone who didn't fit into either of those first 2 buckets, basically. And one of the things you'll notice is that those who committed sexual offenses and did not have a CoSA recidivated at a rate of 32%, whereas the comparison group for the same type of sexual offenders that had a CoSA had a 22% reduction in comparative recidivism rate with a 10% overall rate. So in that 22% of folks who were the difference that succeeded, I'd submit that 2 important things are happening there. One is the important thing, first and foremost, that there are no more victims associated with those individuals. The second is by virtue of their not having recidivated, they remain stably housed in communities. So we're beginning to see how CoSA becomes a value-added investment in housing stabilization for individuals who we were able to get out to begin with, in part because of the pre-case plan that included the CoSA as an enhancement of correction supervision. So we're flipping the script there a little bit. And that took shape around 2010 when we began to combine these CoSAs with rental assistance through our grants that Liz described. In FY15, 13 individuals who had the combination of sexual offenses, and again, these are generally high risk and high need, and got transitional housing. So that was a pretty intensive wraparound approach. And as that research showed that you just saw, as well as some qualitative research, many of the end notes that were the themes of Dr. Bumby's presentation were what the core members themselves attributed to their stabilization in the community: pro-social opportunities, social support, social capital. So Liz is going to take us through a couple specific examples.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about 2 different but very strong programs in our state that blend CoSAs with some type of housing. So the first is in St. Albans. We have a program where all residents participate in either a CoSA or a reintegration circle, which is a little bit less intensive way for folks to reconnect with community volunteers, as well as case management and on-site employment services. So these folks begin in a 4-bedroom shared apartment where there's on-site visits from staff during the week, some activities and programming in the evenings and weekends, a weekly dinner and house meeting, as well as connections to general services that are provided by the Community Justice Center, which includes workshops and learning opportunities, budgeting classes, sort of those soft skills that folks are not getting through the DOC. After a period of 3 to 6 months, they'll transition to 1 to 2 bedroom apartments where they're living either independently or with a roommate. Those are generally master leased by the municipality, so the rent is guaranteed to the landlord each month, and the participants pay directly to the Justice Center a program fee. And then eventually they graduate to independent living where they're paying the full rent, but they continue oftentimes with case management or services as needed. And then a very different program in our state capital works with all CoSA participants, and these folks hold their own lease. The Community Justice Center staff work as a support person and liaison to the landlord, so their job is to find willing landlords and open apartments before someone reenters the community, and then develop a relationship with the landlord where there's open communication and clear expectations about when they can help and how they can help. Generally, there's 3 to 6 months of rental assistance provided by the Justice Center, as well as the long-term case management and help with problem solving if things arise for at least that year period where they're engaged with the CoSA. And also this Justice Center has on-site employment support and educational opportunities for folks.
I think you went one ahead. Hold on. I double skipped. That might be it. We had a couple of final points. I don't think they're displayed as a slide in front of you. Here it is. What does this work? Social capital, as I think I mentioned at the outset, is really a foundational piece. Again, if you think about what's our end goal, if it truly is reintegration, then purely professionally delivered services really can never fully realize that. Not to say that they're not incredibly necessary and increasingly important to have them be as strong and evidence-based as possible. But ultimately, communities depend on self-regulating individuals, and what we know helps people self-regulate is if they have life chances and opportunities born of strong relational networks. This works in Vermont in part because we already have the built-in small community scale. However, as I mentioned earlier, I would encourage you to think about how you could chunk this down on the principles, the operating principles, into a scalable size. I would be very interested in having a cross-national dialogue about how these principles really translate and what are ways that even in our biggest urban centers we can look at, small neighborhoods as, again, those are probably bigger than some of our communities here in Vermont, but that's where people know one another, right? Again, the strong interconnectedness and either leveraging it where it connects or creating it. There's a radical inclusion philosophy that CoSA is predicated on, which basically says, like it or not, if you are in this community, you are part of this social ecology, and we're going to create these connections. There's a broader culture of civic engagement here in Vermont. It's really cold in the winter, and people need to help one another and kind of get on with what it means to hopefully, live mutually advancing lives. So, that's very real, and the more opportunities that communities can create to foster interdependence here, I think that accounts for some of our initial success. And then the last thing real quickly is that we work with a highly collaborative framework and non-governmental organization partnerships, which really tees up the need for clear expectations. And that takes the form of well-written and well-managed grants and memorandums of understanding that place appropriate responsibility and liabilities on the professionals and leverage the best complementary things that non-professionals as well as non-governmental professionals in the housing field need to do. So in and of itself, we really seek to model the very same things that corrections tries to do with the very same population we're talking about here, those who've committed sexual offenses. Clear expectations, high degree of support, and a high degree of accountability. So from a social discipline perspective, we're working with to ensure the best possible outcomes for all stakeholders. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Liz. To share another story from the community, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Solomon to discuss effective solutions to housing registered sex offenders used by Sponsors, Inc. in Eugene, Oregon. Paul Solomon is the Executive Director of Sponsors, Inc., an organization that has been providing reentry services to people with criminal histories in Eugene, Oregon since 1973. Solomon also serves as Vice Chair of the Lane County Public Safety Coordinating Council and is the Chair of Lane County's Reentry Task Force. He was appointed by Governor Kitzhaber as a citizen member of the Governor's Reentry Council. Paul?
Thanks, Lahiz. I have the pleasure today of sharing with you the housing models that we've developed over the years for people convicted of sex offenses who are returning to our community in the Eugene, Oregon area, homeless and indigent. So with that, I think I will kick it off and share a little of our history. Sponsors was founded in 1973 by a group of community activists and Catholic nuns. We began providing transitional housing on a pretty small scale for people with criminal histories in 1988 with a 5-bed house for men. We've grown incrementally over the years and now manage 15 buildings on 6 sites with 150 beds of transitional and long-term housing for people with criminal histories. Next month, we'll break ground on a new permanent housing project that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I would like to note that, like my peers throughout the presentation, I want to attempt to use person-first language to describe individuals or people who have been convicted of a sex offense. I can't think of a more negatively charged term than sex offender, and the language we use really does make a difference. So with that, and to the next slide here. The target population that we serve are primarily men and women released from state prison who are assessed as moderate to very high risk to reoffend. We do not serve any low-risk individuals. Additionally, we've prioritized serving some of our more vulnerable returning citizens, including women with children, veterans, people convicted of sex crimes, people with disabilities and mental illness, and seniors. On a rather sad note, Oregon currently has the highest concentration of people over the age of 55 in the United States. We employ the risk needs responsivity model, and we triage our resources to the highest risk, meaning we have a limited resource. We're constantly backed up with people trying to get into our program. So it's one of the ways that we're able to screen people out, triaging to the highest risk. We use the LSCMI, a validated risk assessment tool, to assess risk and needs and to develop our case plans. We also use the Eureka, which is the University of Rhode Island Change Assessment, to gauge a person's motivation and treatment readiness. And our partners at Parole and Probation use specialized assessments, including the ODERA, Stable and Acute, and others. Case plans are developed focusing on the top 2 criminogenic risk factors. In many cases, before we are able to deal with risk factors, we must first address responsivity issues that can present pretty formidable barriers. As a system, we've been working to align our resources to more effectively provide the necessary dosage that we need to apply to those people that are at moderate and high risk. Wherein we are presently in the process of developing an app that we will use to more effectively track dosage across the system. So today I'm going to take a look at 3 different housing models for people convicted of sex crimes. Transitional housing for people coming directly out of jail or prison that is usually 60 to 120 days in duration. Long-term housing on the same site as a transitional housing facility for up to a year, and another program where we provide long-term housing where people have traditional leases and stay for as long as they're on supervision. And finally, a permanent housing project that we're getting ready to break ground on. Next slide. So first, our transitional housing project. Roosevelt Crossing is a men's facility that we opened in 2010 that was funded with low-income housing tax credits, some stimulus funding, and a Department of Veterans Affairs grant and per diem capital grant that fully funded this $6 million project. The facility has 47 residential units with 74 beds. 62 of those beds are transitional housing where people stay, as I said, for, on average 60 to 120 days. And we have an additional 12 units that are kind of like private apartments where clients can stay for up to a year. And those are usually for people who have been convicted of sex offenses or have been locked up for 20 or 30 years and aren't quite ready to transition at the 60 or 120-day mark. Additionally, we have developed a range of programs that we provide on-site that are really designed to target specific criminogenic risk factors. We have a Second Chance Act mentoring program that was started in 2010 as well. We've matched up over 500 volunteer mentors with men and women who have been released from prison. We're currently in the process of conducting a randomized control trial on the program through a second VJA, Second Chance Act mentoring grant that we received last year. We also have a Reentry Resource Center that's an employment program that places between 25 and 50 people a month in full-time jobs, in addition to workshops, a computer lab, and they also provide funding for identification and bus passes, which are major barriers to success for folks. We also provide evidence-based parenting curriculum, evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy. We use MRT, moral recognition therapy. We have a veterans grant and per diem program that focuses on services for vets, and a monthly legal clinic through a partnership with the University of Oregon School of Law. Additionally, we use change company journals for skill building exercises designed to target specific risk factors and to add on to the dosage that we're trying to achieve while people are with us. I should also note that on any given day, approximately 1 out of 3 of our male clients are people with sex offense convictions. And this closely mirrors the DOC population where, I think the last time I looked, 29% of the people in the Oregon Department of Corrections were serving a sex offense sentence. So I wanted to provide some pictures to give people a sense of what our facilities look like. Our buildings are designed to be a contradiction to institutional environments. Excuse me. They are colorful, warm, and welcoming. We work hard to ensure our facilities are well maintained and beautifully landscaped. The challenge is the argument that projects like ours drive down property values, and it sends a strong message to the public and the people we serve that our returning citizens are valued members of our community. The resident rooms are all double occupancy with their own private bathrooms, with the exception of 4 single occupancy ADA compliant units for people with disabilities. The clients share a residential kitchen. Each wing houses 5 units with up to 10 residents and has its own private kitchen and living room. We have a walk-in fridge and freezer in our warehouse. With 74 residents at capacity, we now have the ability to buy food in bulk from wholesalers, achieving economies of scale that were not possible in our smaller programs. We also have 2 POs cited at the facility from Lane County Parole and Probation. We work really closely with Lane County Parole and Probation, and it helps to have them on site for a variety of reasons. It's pretty unusual that they're there to arrest someone for a violation. More often they're there to work with clients who are on their caseload or assist us in any number of issues that we have. I mentioned earlier that we have a program where clients can stay for up to a year. This is our honors building. And these are all 1-bedroom apartments where residents pay monthly rents of $350 and live more independently than they do in the transitional housing program. Over there, they're required to do twice weekly UAs, check in with their case managers daily. This is less structured. It's one step away from independent living. We also have a fitness and recreation center. Providing gym and basketball court on site gives participants easy access to leisure and recreational activities. And, we missed a slide. We have administrative offices and conference rooms that are constantly used for board meetings, drug and alcohol treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, 12-step meetings, workshops, and other services that benefit program participants. We'll switch gears and talk a little bit about screening applicants. So staff regularly visit releasing institutions in Oregon and place Lane County residents on call-out to recruit and describe our programs. Presently, our beds are booked up at least 6 to 8 months in advance. So if people don't begin the process of applying to get in around the 1-year mark, the likelihood of them getting in is often slim. We have beds committed as far out as 2028. I receive 40 to 50 letters a week from potential participants that I respond to personally each weekend. We also receive referrals from institutional counselors and POs. Also, to assist with the screening process, we receive monthly reports from the Department of Corrections that provide accurate release information, risk scores, crime of conviction, and other helpful information, and as we make determinations about who is going to get into the program and who isn't. Next slide. So I'm talking about the transitional housing. As I mentioned, average length of stay is roughly 90 days. Participants check in twice daily with their case manager. They're required to submit to twice weekly drug and alcohol screens in addition to randoms. They're required to put a minimum of 50% of their earnings on account to ensure that they're actually saving for permanent housing, as that's one of our primary long-term goals. And they're required to engage in programming that as determined by risk needs assessment and the case plan that is developed when the client first enters the program. In working with people convicted of sex offenses, we do not segregate residents based on their crime of conviction. Crime of conviction is not disclosed to residents, and one of the things that we are very stringent about is harassment, intimidation, threats of violence because of a person's crime of conviction, race, gender, sexual orientation, any of those are grounds for immediate eviction. Long-term housing. We have a facility that houses 10 units of long-term housing solely for men with sex offense convictions. This facility was designed to meet the needs of the people we serve with sex offense convictions who, because of their convictions, have difficulty acquiring permanent sustainable housing. Excuse me, I had something in my throat. All residents are employed, in school, or on disability and able to self-finance rents of up to $350 a month. We have one on-site property manager who oversees that project. Now I want to talk a little bit about siting facilities. It helps to have a long track record of working with people with criminal histories. The process can be rather daunting, given the outpouring of objections that people have about people with sex crimes that Dr. Bumby talked about at the beginning. But there are a few things that we've learned over the years. The process of establishing housing for people convicted of sex crimes is much easier if you're able to acquire property that is appropriately zoned versus the process of having to go through a rezoning where public hearings are held. Regardless of zoning, outreach is absolutely essential. When searching for properties, there are a couple things to consider. Make sure the site is close to public transportation, social services, and parole and probation. Try not to site projects in the middle of residential neighborhoods. Outreach should begin as soon as possible. Attend neighborhood association meetings to explain your project and dispel myths about sex offenders. Historically, we've spent a lot of time educating people, going door to door, mailing flyers for the immediate vicinity, explaining the project. It's also critically important to line up the support of elected and public safety officials. Have them attend community meetings with you and discuss the public safety value of these type of projects. If necessary, a citizens advisory committee can be established to guide the project through construction, giving nearby residents an opportunity to voice concerns in a structured format. I'm now going to talk about our newest project, the Oaks. It's a new low-income housing project designed to serve people with criminal histories. It's a partnership between sponsors, Lane County's Housing Authority, and Lane County Parole and Probation. The project will house 54 one-bedroom apartments for people with criminal histories. Total project cost is a little over $9 million. The project is primarily funded with low-income housing tax credits, system development charge waivers, private foundation grants, individual donations, and contributions from local government. At this point, we have about 95% of the funding in hand, and we'll break ground next month. Very exciting project. Move forward. Okay. So I want to wrap up with how our programs are funded. Our transitional housing programs beds cost about $35 a day, and they're funded with community corrections and state justice reinvestment grants, and they pay for a majority of the beds at Roosevelt Crossing. I mentioned that we had a VA grant and per diem capital contribution to that project, but they also pay for every bed that we house a vet in with a criminal history, and we have 10 beds dedicated for those folks. Additionally, we were the lead agency in an SCA demonstration project grant that paid for another 10 beds. That grant is ending, and the county has picked up the funding for those beds as well. The long-term housing project, the 10-unit facility that we discussed, is relatively inexpensive to fund. We have one staff person there that costs about $35,000 a year. Clients actually pay rents of $350 a month to cover the lease on the property. But this is a project that's not designed for people coming directly out of prison, but people who are already stabilized and have the ability to self-finance their rents on a monthly basis. For the Oaks, our newest project, we currently have 2 FTE scheduled to be on that facility at a total cost of $100,000 a year, and are being paid for with Oregon Justice Reinvestment dollars. Some of it's coming out of the low-income housing tax credit pro forma. And we also have a HUD DOJ Pay for Success grant pending that would actually double the staff on that site and allow us to do a randomized control trial of the intervention. So that concludes my presentation. I think I can kick it back over to the team and we can start fielding questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. This concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. With that, we will go ahead and answer questions. Please remember to enter any questions into the Q&A panel box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So for the 2 programs for Vermont and Oregon, a question came in: how are registered sex offenders referred to or enrolled in your program? Can you speak a little bit about that?
How are they referred to? Was that the question? How are they enrolled?
Yes, how are they enrolled in your program? More specifically, do they also have to be released to Vermont or Oregon to be part of the program? And how do you, how are they enrolled?
Great. Well, I'll take a crack at it, and then Derek and Liz, you can chime in. So here in Oregon, people are required to go back to the county that they were last residing in. So the people we are serving are by and large Lane County residents. These are people who've grown up in our community and are coming back to our community whether we like it or not. They self-identify. They're not mandated to come to the program. So through our reach out process or through word of mouth in the institutions, they can either self-initiate the application process or be referred by a correctional counselor or parole officer.
Yeah, in Vermont, it's a very similar process. I think the only additional step is that the district manager of PMP office also needs to approve of the connection with either housing or CoSA.
Yeah, and I guess the one, go ahead, Liz.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
The other thing I was going to say is that parole and probation does have to approve where a sex offender is living or a person with a sex offense conviction is living. So when they see on The field investigation that a person is coming to sponsors, they pretty much categorically approve our sites. But if it's a private residence, it would require a field investigation.
Thank you. Let's see here. Another question. Are there any estimates on how many people are held past their maximum release date due to lack of approved housing?
So in Vermont, we don't hold people past their maximum. We do have about an average of 150 people on any given day that are held past their minimum, but when someone maxes, they're released.
Same here. Dr. Bundy might be able to speak to that nationally a little more.
So that's a tough one. Off the top of my head, I don't know. There have been some states where the numbers are really, really, really high, and so high, in fact, that I've sort of expected some lawsuits to come out of it. I don't know if they ever did, but I think it really varies from state to state.
Thanks, Kurt. Let's see here. A few questions actually came in about CoSA. So where can we find different CoSAs? Is Vermont the only state with a CoSA? As well as a few different ones. And I'll take a stab at this one. So CoSA was actually a model developed in Canada that was brought to the United States. And we actually have a few different sites that use CoSA. Vermont is one of them, as well as Colorado. You can also find CoSAs in Minnesota, in Oregon, in Pennsylvania, in California, and in Washington. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about the model, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on our website, and it's also going to be on the screen in just a few minutes. So please be sure to reach out to me, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that. Another question here, and Kurt, maybe you'll know, can you provide a few examples of states that have removed the residency restrictions?
Yeah, you know, things change so quickly every year with this legislation. I know that initially, and I guess these are more states that never did it, but it was based on a lot of discussions and training and information that they received. I know Kansas and Colorado were two states, I believe, never, or at least at the time, hadn't imposed them because of what the research showed. I know that a few other states have looked at it. I know New Hampshire and Maine, I believe Idaho also looked at residence restrictions. And I'm blanking on the state that I had just read about in which someone said, you know what, I think we're going to reconsider during this session, not necessarily removing them completely, but backing off a little bit more. But I just can't remember who that was off the top of my head. But I can dig that up, and or you can email me, and I'm happy to get that.
Thank you, Kurt. Another question that seems to have popped up quite a bit is local and political buy-in and problems with securing funding, as well as the question of how to deal with NIMBYism. So I think this can go out to the entire panel. So how to deal with NIMBYism, local and political buy-in, or problems securing funding. Anyone can speak to that.
Well, I addressed it in one of the slides that I had. I mean, it's an incredibly challenging issue. It helps to have the political support so that when you do begin projects, you're not the only one that's standing up there talking about wanting to bring, you know, a project into a community. Historically, we've tried to get partners from the Sheriff's Office, the Police Department, Department of Corrections, parole and probation, as well as elected officials, so that when we have these what can often be very charged community conversations, we're doing it with very supportive partners in the public safety system. And I also think transparency is important. You know, there are a lot of places where you can purchase a piece of property that's zoned appropriately. There is no prohibition on who lives there unless it's a community that has geographic restrictions for people convicted of sex crimes. And you could just set up a project with the neighbors being none the wiser until they find out about it. But in my experience, when people have done that, it's usually backfired. I think it really makes sense in most cases to reach out to the immediate neighbors. And I think, as Dr. Bumby explained, there are a lot of myths associated with sex offenders. Most of the people that we work with, their victims are known to them. They're not stranger offenses. And that's what people in the community are usually most worried about. We have conversations about risk and what that means and what we're doing to mitigate risk. So it's not an easy conversation. The other thing that I mentioned in my slide is the development of a community advisory committee. And this is a body that can be established with elected officials, people from the housing program, public safety officials, and neighbors, so that you actually have a forum where people can voice their concerns. And I think those are all strategies that can be helpful from my experience.
I would say in Vermont, we haven't had a lot of luck citing larger projects that are specifically for serving folks with sex offenses, and so scattered site models have worked better for us. I think our numbers are small enough that it's a realistic way to do it, but you know, by having folks in private apartments, you don't have to go through the zoning process.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is, go ahead, Kurt.
I was just going to say, you know, one of the issues that's come up as part of this question, or at least a piece of this question, but it's also come up with others, that is how we engage policymakers and community members around to address this negative public opinion or the negative sentiment, the myths and barriers that you just spoke to. And one of the things that I think is always really important to recommend is that this is something that you want to do as a team. As you just said, you want to have folks who represent law enforcement, victim advocacy, treatment, supervision. And part of what I think is important to happen is first you talk with them about, you know, what we know about this population, that they're diverse, they don't all look alike, could be you, and then talk about the various strategies in place so that they know there's a lot that's happening to keep them safe. And then, you know, eventually you can work into the things that here's what we know is really effective, and these are the things we're doing, and here are the things that don't make you safer. But the message is always around victim protection and community safety. That's sort of your, like, two recurring points about everything that you talk about. Same kind of a thing with policymakers. And, again, using a team approach, because policymakers aren't going to listen to just one interest group, right? But if you have multiple folks talking about together the same issues and the same research and the same things about what makes their community safer, I think they're much more likely to hear the message. Then our job is, I think, to help them figure out how best to sell that to their constituents. And I think the simple answer to that is you sell it through being around public safety, because their fear is soft on sex offenders. But if it's around public safety and making their community safer, I think that's the message that we've got to help communities hear and the politicians hear, lawmakers hear, and connecting that to the laws that we have and what works and those that don't.
Yeah, Kurt, that was so well put. This is Derek from Corrections, and just to really echo that, and I would say our experience here in Vermont very much is along the lines of what you've described by virtue of the strong external partnerships. I think the challenge that statutory agencies often face is when they're trying to pull off the heaviest lift, which of course is in this case trying to find housing for this particular population, and there isn't that sort of undergirding of trust and institutional to local relationships. So in a way, our housing grants across the state and our grants for these community justice centers really become a currency for a much more local and at least diverse mix of voices. Of course, the NIMBY is going to be there, but there's a much better chance when those conversations happen in Vermont that there are a couple people in the room who have clout and political currency in those communities because they've been attached to one of our, grant-providing agencies. And that's really the idea of civil society, right? That, we can't prop these things up purely on governmental services for a number of reasons. So it's taken us time. I do want to stress that, though. I mean, the challenge is that we have today's problems, but for us, solutions that have, been many years in the making, too. So, that's real. But, we can start where we are.
Thank you, everyone. Another question that came in, and Vermont team, I think you may have some insight on this one, is are the vast majority of mentors for the CoSA program volunteers or paid social workers or case managers, or is case management provided by the different individuals from the CoSA core member support group?
Yeah, so those 3 to 5 folks that sit on the team are volunteers. There's also one paid staff person who helps kind of coordinate the team, and they'll sit in the team as well. But the case management is offered outside of the CoSA.
And one of the things we've heard after the qualitative research where we surveyed the core, what they attributed some of the impact of the CoSA was to the very fact that these were volunteers. The fundamental gift and dignity that they were conferring upon the core members by virtue of them giving of their time had a really transformational effect on many of these individuals. It was something that literally could not be purchased. So what we purchase is the capacity for communities to harness that type of social capital.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Liz. Another question that came in, maybe Kurt, I'm not sure if you have some insight on this one. This individual is working within a municipality with a significant homeless population, and their question is, how would you address issues around screening in emergency shelters? Does don't ask, don't tell work?
I missed the last half of that. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, sorry. So this individual is working within a municipality with a significant homeless population. How would you address issues around screening in emergency shelters? Does don't ask, don't tell work in this situation?
Boy, I don't know that I have, I'm not sure that I'm well positioned to answer that one. I don't know that don't ask, don't tell is necessarily the way to go because, I think it's important that there are safety plans in place if there are any particular risk factors for any of those individuals. We want to make sure that they're adequately addressed. So I think the don't ask, don't tell could create problems from that perspective. I also understand that the don't ask, don't tell might in fact mean that the person can't stay there. The other panelists, do you have any thoughts about that?
What was it? I didn't catch the question. I missed it too.
No problem.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So they're looking for some guidance in terms of assessments within emergency shelters. And yeah.
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. Another question, and this one is for the sites. We have some insight. So who are your main community partners, and do you work with an evaluator, a researcher? And some of this was covered in the presentation, but a good, just some highlights.
We can start. So in Vermont, for transitional housing specifically, our partners range from designated mental health agencies to local substance abuse programs, general housing providers or folks that work with other people who are homeless or struggling with housing. Trying to think of, and then obviously the community justice centers, which are either nonprofits or parts of a municipality.
Yeah, and I think there was an evaluative component to the question too. Yeah, so you saw some of our data, not specific to this CoSA model. We're also doing some internal data gathering and analysis about broader outcomes for those who received any transitional housing services to the department, but that's a function of internal gathering. But yeah, I think being connected to an evaluative component, especially if it can be an independent one, is obviously very important. I mean, at some point in the process, we all want to know, if the investment is an effective one, and we have to usually defend the investments we make for those of us who are coming from, state government side. So one of the things I would suggest to those who are in the process of either building new programs, building it from the front-end perspective of being clear about what you're measuring and how your processes align with evaluability, so you're not trying to retrofit an evaluation to an existing program and maybe one that's changed over time and changed the target population and changed the referral methods. Those are key things. Those are how you can tell a story that I think all stakeholders are going to want to hear.
I would add to that, we're in the process of embarking on 2 different randomized control trials, and it's a lot of work, and we've been looking for this level of research, and RCTs are kind of the gold standard, but you have to have a large enough pool of people to be able to do it so that you have a control group, and it's not an easy thing to do, and it's very expensive. So it doesn't, not everybody can do RCTs, but this is an area where there's clearly a lack of research. We don't have enough good research and data on housing programs and the effectiveness of the intervention. In terms of who we partner with at the beginning, the one thing that I would add is we work really closely with our other housing providers in addition to all of the other nonprofits that provide support services. We work really hard to cultivate relationships with our housing authority, with our low-income housing property management groups, because those are the folks that often will be willing to rent to our people if we community case manage them or provide some different incentives. So it's important that we constantly are cultivating new housing resources.
Great, thank you. Another quick question, and I think this may be the last one. What research topics do you think would be of interest to the field going forward, specifically in terms of this topic?
Well, I definitely think that one topic that would be great is to look at, take it a step further. We've identified that there are some risk increasing factors related to unstable housing, and I think it would be really great if we could take it a step further and really look to see, controlling set of variables, is there a way to identify if, in fact, housing instability as a result of some of these other things is more problematic in terms of recidivism or other violations. I mean, obviously we have a little bit of research on that already, but I think pursuing that line of research would be really good. Also identifying, are there certain types of housing alternatives or options, whether that's halfway house or traditional housing or apartment, whatever those things may be. Are there some that seem shared living arrangements? Are there some that seem to be more effective in terms of stability and successful outcomes with individuals with sex offenses? I think that'd be another interesting thing to look at.
I agree with everything Dr. Mummy said. I would also add that we need to really hold up and highlight the research that's out there, particularly around geographic restrictions all too often policymakers are not using the available research when making new laws that relate to people convicted of sex crimes. It is kind of the political football that everybody likes to kick. And, you know, I would love to see sentencing more evidence-based. It's one of the areas, one of the reasons why 29% of the people in Oregon's prisons are there for sex crimes is because they have really long sentences. It's not because we send so many of them to prison, but because they stack up in prison. So it'd be nice to see the research married with the policy.
Great, thank you. So I know we're 1 minute away. So I just want to take the chance to thank our presenters, Kurt, Derek, Liz, Paul, thanks to BJ and the National Reentry Resource Center, and to the audience for joining us on this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Maureen Ritchie, another policy analyst here at our organization. The webinar, again, is going to be released early next week, and you will also be able to contact our speakers. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Good job.